So let's start off. Sorry. But hang on, Charles. Before you go any further, let's just start off by saying we don't have rain this time around.
Well, that is what I was going to say.
You speak for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. You speak for yourself. We've got plenty here, but hopefully not audible. And so this is unfashionably an apology. I think not. Well, I was the one that was in the room. The elephant zone last week was very, very wet. Funnily enough, it wasn't because the rain was hammering on the roof. It was the sound of the rain rolling off the edge of the roof and into the gutter. But that's neither here nor there to an extent. Very sorry that it was quite so loud, quite so distracting. Funnily enough, reading through the comments, not everybody found it to be off-putting. I think some people were pleased by the sound, and I think there is something to be said for that. I don't know if you can really recreate it in an electronic sense, but the sound of running water is absolutely fantastic. But I'm not sure that was quite what we did. So an apology, because for me in that room, it didn't seem as loud as it subsequently came out on the recording, is my view.
I'll tell you something. It was nothing last week compared to today, because that has been, the volume of of not only the rain hitting the roof, but running down that gutter today was, it was off the charts. It was amazing. We had some pretty spectacular rain this morning.
Yeah. That's a great thing. I mean, clearly global warming is just destroying the UK. It's just, it's getting so hot that it's raining.
Look, the farmers, it's going to be interesting, Charles. I don't know what your thoughts are, because farmers have been complaining because we haven't had any rain this year so far. And then over the last couple of weeks, things have turned about somewhat, but I can see it going the other way over the next month or so.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. We are at that time of year where it's it does tend to go one way or the other. It's either a very wet period of the year, sort of comparably, or it's far too dry. But I think it raises a load of really interesting points, especially with arable agriculture and how the particularly, well, for now, hybridization of crops and stuff works. You see, say you take things that are not interfered with at all. So a lot of grasses that haven't been re-sown or whatever. So sort of hedgerow grasses, and you see how things will respond according to nature. In that, if it's very dry, they will give out seed as a sort of control mechanism in order for there to be progeny if they die off. And similarly, if there's enough water, they'll grow instead before issuing seed and all the rest of it. Whereas you look at crops that are hybridized, and one example in the UK that's really interesting to watch is maize, which is largely used for winter feed for cattle. And I can think of periods here where, it would definitely constitute drought in that period of time that the maize has been in the ground. There's been no rainfall at all, and yet it just keeps on growing. It's very, very odd to watch, and it's just it's completely unreal. And you think, right, well, if that's able to do that, what's it going to be doing to the inside of a cow when it eats it, and consequently, what's that going to be doing to the condition of the meat if it's going to be beef, or indeed the milk if it's going to be dairy? And all these things just reminders of how far removed we are from nature in its natural state, and how people have got so utterly used to that it's not even a consideration anymore. Stuff just grows, and that's that. And I think in the UK, going back to it, okay, it might appear boring for people that aren't engaged with it, but actually it is enormously relevant. We had a incredibly wet winter, not the one just gone, but the previous one, and there was a real effect, because it was bad for both camps. I mean, livestock, terrible conditions because the ground was so horrifically boggy, or if you're trying to get anything in the ground to grow, it was just way too wet. But the amount that was lost because it just drowned was phenomenal. And that was a kind of, that was a reminder that I think the public did have some sense of the weather on this. Of course, for anyone to say, oh well, that's the way it's going to go because of climate change, is ludicrous. But I think people do need to be reminded of the way in which the weather does actually affect stuff.
when I was in Holland, what do you call it? Netherlands. Holland is just, I think, one of the provinces. I always get this wrong. In 2023, they were telling me about the globalist attack on agriculture in their country. Is the same thing happening in the UK?
100%. And it's fascinating because, Britain, as everybody knows, Britain came out of the European Union a few years ago. And up until that point, all the sort of industrialized farms that are effectively, they're not viable businesses in many ways. They were reliant upon payments from the European Union under the Common Agricultural Policy to keep themselves in profit. And after we left the European Union, in inverted commas, the Common Agricultural Policy money stopped flowing, and the UK government said that they would replace it with various rewilding schemes and renaturization and all this kind of stuff. So farmers have signed up for that. And in fact, they seem to close the application process a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago because, well, whether it was there were too many or whatever. But now they're looking at under the spending review, maybe not even letting that program run its course. So farmers are, they're not viable as a business because of many factors, not least the way that supermarkets have decimated, their income, but also just the fact that grain markets are internationalized, globalized, and so they are trying to sell grains at prices sometimes that aren't even covering their costs, or if they are covering their costs, only marginally. So, farming by itself seems to be, Charles, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to be that it's increasingly unviable as a business, partly because we are, as individuals, increasingly unwilling to pay for food in a way that we once did. And you go back several decades and the proportion of our income that we were prepared to spend on food was that much higher. But we've got used to what the supermarkets have done to the farming industry, plus government policy has done to the farming industry. And we prefer to go on 4 foreign holidays a year instead.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this before, quite closely associated with this. I think if you look at it the other way round, and it would apply to any system or anything that we identify on either a national or worldwide basis. Who does the system suit? And it's certainly not the farmers, but it does suit the great food cartels. So if you look at what they're getting out of it and then you reverse engineer from that point, then you see exactly why we are in the situation that we are in. And they can only do what they do because government steals money from people in order to effectively pump it back into the food industry. I mean, as I say, you don't have to just apply this to food, but for that to be able to happen, it means that people who are trying to farm in, I was about to use the word conventional, but we have to be careful with that because of what has become conventional. But that within itself, that the sort of the wider agricultural industry, which incorporates the food outlets, the supermarkets, all that kind of thing, but also the chemicals and the pharmaceuticals and all the other inputs that are contributing to it, they all profit greatly from it, but they can only do that because exactly like Mike describes, the subsidy system is an enabling process, a financial instrument, in effect, to condition people to do a particular thing, which is not to say that you can't do it outside of that. We've talked about that before, whether in the UK or elsewhere. The conditions are very much against you, and you just have to think totally differently about what you're trying to do. But yes, I mean, you could say this is part of a process of destruction of agriculture as we know it, but actually that's part of it. The other part, of course, is that it is sweeping aside all of that in order that the likes of Kraft and Cargill and whatever can do what they do, and indeed how they play into all the rest of it. And you look at those guys now, of course, are all, like everybody else, in the grips of AI and tech, what they call innovation, but frankly it's just yet more removal of people from the land and removal of people from having any idea as to what food is. But as I say, we've talked about it a lot before, so yes, it's an intentional destruction, but there is a specific purpose beyond simply willful sort of nihilistic destruction.
And we can't. Sorry. I was just going to say, Jerm, we can't let that pass without just mentioning. Since Charles has brought in the issue of the big conglomerates, the gene editing plants, the sort of factory production of food. Part of the reason that this is happening is undoubtedly because there's an intention that food is not going to be produced on the land anymore. It's going to be produced in factories using organisms that have been genetically engineered. Now, they'll claim that in the legislation and so on, they'll claim that it's not genetic engineering or it's not genetic modification, rather to use the correct term, because they say that the organisms that are eventually produced don't have any foreign genetic material in them, but they are these factory farmed products or factory produced products are allowed to be developed using genetic modification as an interim step. The claim is that the foreign genetic material is removed at the end of the process, but nonetheless, it is not, in my opinion. Charles, again, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but it is not, in my opinion, equivalent to selective breeding, because it is significantly more. There's more genetic messing about going on than can possibly happen through careful selective breeding.
No, I would totally agree with Mike, and I think, again, I know we have, I think, covered some of this before, but I think the other element to it is you can't know, and it's staggering from a scientific point of view to suggest that say something could be done in a in a sort of hybridized conventional fashion that would take, say, 10, 20, 30 years to achieve, and all you're saying is you're condensing that amount of time into a much shorter period, and your overriding assumption in all of that is that condensing that period of time isn't going to make any difference, as though you know exactly how each stage of that will turn out. It is utterly ridiculous and completely irresponsible for anybody to put that forward for two reasons, or at least two reasons that sort of I have on the top of my head now. First of all, you don't know how the organism itself will turn out to be, compared with that process, but also you don't know how it will relate to its environment, how its environment will relate to it. That's the other bit that nobody considers. So the knock-on effect of altering a food chain in such an incredibly abrupt manner by putting something into, whether it's let's say it's a breed of sheep that has not gone through that 30 or 40 year period, and therefore its environment has not adapted to it. It hasn't adapted to its environment. It's an absolutely radical change, and the absurd position that people have on sort of protecting the environment, or this confusion with sort of climate and nature and the conflation and frankly the complete and willful misunderstanding of the situation. But people are unable to sort of pull this bit out and realise that it's totally and utterly wrong. It just because you don't know, which is not to say it definitely will be a disaster, but you can't possibly say that it won't be.
Oh, what I was going to say earlier is one of the driving factors of all of this is, of course, the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda. South Africa has about 80% of land that's used for agriculture. The UK has about 71%. Compare that to Hong Kong, which is 2%. That's pretty much no agricultural land.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would do there is question that statistic. 71% of Britain's land may be classed as agricultural land, but that doesn't mean that it's being used for agriculture. A lot of it has been, as already mentioned, put into rewilding programs. A lot of it has solar panels and wind turbines on it, and a lot of it just simply isn't being farmed. So you know, the better statistic for me, Jeremy, is that I think we're 40% food independent. So 60%, I think it's more than 60% now of our food is, I could be wrong about that, but somewhere around that region is imported. And so, you know, I think that's to a large degree indicative of the fact that so many people have left the farming industry in recent decades.
Well, it depends. It really does depend how you categorize it, and again, just going back to the statistics, like Mike says, they are terribly misleading, because it is that percentage is classification by land use, and that doesn't mean that any farming has to be conducted on it for it to count as agricultural, and that's, you know, that's one thing from particularly the last year, actually, or a year and a bit, I suppose, about a year and a half now, that some of those figures have fluctuated really wildly, and you see the effect of these sorts of subsidies. You see how incredibly effective they can be, and the one set of statistics that sticks in my head is that one of these, in fact, the scheme that Mike referred to, that was shut down, and then they've sort of reneged slightly and opened it up again. But the sustainable farming incentive, which was basically meant to take land out of production of food, and you know, they say put it into nature recovery, but of course that again is, you know, I don't know if we've got time necessarily to go into it, but that in itself is such a gigantic con, because in actual fact what they're suggesting is not treating the particular bit of ground on its own merits. So it'll be, you just get a bird seed, a like wild bird mix. So you're going to put in a whole load of species into, say, a wildflower meadow or whatever that aren't native to that particular bit of ground. And we go back to the hybridizing or genetic modification of organisms, and you are absolutely disrupting that ecosystem by doing that, because all the let's say all the butterflies, all the worms or whatever, everything that relates to the plant species that should be there suddenly don't know what to do, because what should be there isn't. Okay, you could say, well, if you're starting from something that's just a chemically treated field of wheat, then frankly, what's the difference? But there is a difference, and that in itself is done from an utterly wrong start point. So the whole idea of nature recovery is a massive con in the first place. But they started this scheme, and in the first instance, it was unlimited, in that if you farmed 100 acres or 100,000 acres, it didn't matter. You could put the whole of your farm into this scheme, in that, you know, one year you might be producing 100% of your land might be dedicated to producing beef or wheat or whatever. I mean, okay, you hopefully wouldn't be doing that, but still, it could be. And then the following day, you could say, right, we're into SFI 100%. And so the obvious question was to the ministry, to DEFRA, well, so what do you think the effect of this is going to be? I mean, if you're allowing people to de-risk their business to that extent, what do you think is going to happen? Are they going to think, yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I'll roll the dice and maybe make a bit of money on wheat or barley or beans or something? Or should I just take the cash and do a one hit and just sow birdseed, and doesn't matter how it turns out? And DEFRA, in their infinite wisdom and arrogance, said, oh, we don't expect there to be any material change to the circumstance. Go forward 3 months from the time that question was put by UKCOLUMN to DEFRA. After 3 months, they reduced that drastically and said you can only put a quarter of your land into the scheme. And then a couple of months later, they released the statistics, and what's called the uncropped arable land had increased by a factor of 107% over that time period. So, okay, how much of an effect does that actually have, given that our relative sustainability or self-sufficiency is so low? Well, yeah, okay, maybe not that much. But the point to be made is that the influence that is held by the food industry and by the government by virtue of these sort of crooked subsidies is phenomenal, and that will feel the longer term effects of that in over the next few years, because to undo it, the point is that if you have gone into it and you've created a load of land that now cannot produce food, to actually undo that and to start again in order to achieve some sort of profitable exercise for your business is really, really difficult. So it's a sort of, it's kind of a fudge every which way. But I mean, it totally and utterly happened. And so, it's a disaster. But again, people don't have any idea, because going back to the Hong Kong thing, we get round it by importing food, and then at the same time saying, oh, well, Russia's such a terrible threat. Well, so in which case, why are we importing food?
It is a weird concept. If you grow food and then you export it and then import food, the whole thing is a very strange cycle.
It's a great demonstration of how the whole climate narrative is internally inconsistent. We've got to stop driving internal combustion engine cars because we're pumping out all this nasty carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and stuff. We've got to change everything to batteries. But we've just done a deal. The UK's just done a deal with the United States to export product from the UK to the United States, and then to import product from the United States to the UK. This would make sense if we were producing different product, but it's the same product. So please explain to me how this fits with their climate change narrative. It's that in itself demonstrates that the climate change narrative is a pile of nonsense, in my opinion, because they can't even get their own story straight.
And if you look at what's happening here in South Africa, they are building huge farms of solar panels and wind turbines. But yes, the rub. They're building them in the middle of nowhere. And at this stage, they aren't connected to the central power grid. So now, this is beautiful for basically the technocrats, for the UN, for the World Bank, because big loans are going to get taken out so that they can start building the infrastructure.
No, but I mean, at least let's say if you were to give the system the benefit of the doubt and just look at it on common sense ground, South Africa's latitude means that there is at least a case on the solar side of it for it making some degree of sense. You have consistently a more consistent amount of daylight, and indeed you have more sunlight than the UK, and yet the peak and trough. I mean, okay, it's much more acute the further north in the UK that you go, but right up in the north of Scotland or in the Northern Isles, the days in winter are absurdly short, and yet in the summer it's never dark. So how on earth, how are you matching that power input with the requirement? No one on just a common sense basis, and I say this as somebody who has solar panels, but in a completely off-grid capacity, because it makes sense, and I therefore use energy around the delivery of the energy from the sun. So I mean, it makes sense, and it means sort of two fingers to the national grid. But I would never suggest that because it works for me and I can think, okay, well, I can put that machine on now, I can run that now. I would never suggest that you try and run a country's grid on that basis. That's totally crazy,
Charles. But that's the obvious difference. I don't think any sane person is anti-solar panels or whatever. If you have them on your roof, it's great, but that's not base load. That's the difference.
Well, yeah, but you see, the on the roof thing's really interesting, because that here in the UK, Ed Miliband was talking about that just earlier this week, I think it was, and as though it's a complete revelation. Finally, common sense and this, that, and the other. Yeah, okay, but still, when you look at the wiring diagram, how does that actually work? Well, the way it works, unless he is really suggesting common sense, which I doubt, is that the panels, the out the back of the panel goes the cable out of the house and back into the grid. So if there's a power cut, even if the sun is shining and you've got panels on your house, you will not have electricity because the power goes to the grid and it needs to therefore come back from the grid, as opposed to what I'm describing, which is an off-grid thing where you're able to store the energy because you've got batteries. So in actual fact, the idea, this sort of word that gets bandied around about resilience is absolute rubbish. Because of that, so still you have this central requirement, and there was that. Was it Spain that had the outage the other day? I forget, Mike. I think you spoke about it on the news.
Yeah, it was Spain. Right? Yeah. And Portugal, but mainly Spain.
Yeah. So the peaks and troughs in terms of the delivery versus something like nuclear. How on earth, or basically, if it weren't for the climate narrative, how on earth would anyone have come out of a meeting and said, yeah, okay, well, let's go for the form of energy there's a load of, like, more than we can use during the middle of the day, and then absolutely none at night. I mean, no one would ever have said, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, but as I was saying, it's base load versus secondary power. I mean, solar panels are fantastic. Wind turbines are fantastic, as secondary, but they're not reliable.
But yes, I mean, it's fascinating. This could be a shoehorn too far, but we just before we started recording, we were talking about daylight saving. And
yes, let's talk about daylight savings.
I don't necessarily have a dog in the fight exactly, but it is. It is controversial. Well, I'll tell you what. You start because you were the one that brought it up. You say okay. Your piece.
Okay, so I find the concept of daylight savings ridiculous. So
go on.
As it turns out, we don't have that in South Africa. We don't even have multiple time zones. Technically, South Africa should have 2 time zones, but we don't. So we keep things really simple. If it's darker for an hour longer, then so be it. Just that's it. That's the time.
Mike, what's your? I know you were reluctant to necessarily.
Well, I don't have a dog in this fight, as the saying goes. My preference would be that we don't have it. I also don't really understand what it's actually for. Of course, I grew up being told all kinds of stories about that it's beneficial for farmers and so on. So maybe I should just pass that straight back to you, Charles, since you are a farmer. Is it beneficial to you?
Okay,
well, what's wrong with just changing your alarm? That's all. Why must it be done from the government?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is. You are absolutely correct. I mean that is ultimately what it comes down to. But the way I look at it is that yes, it would be perfectly easy to simply adapt according to the seasons. And okay, in the south of England, it's not so acute, but nonetheless, this time of year, very nearly midsummer. It is light. It's light enough to be outside pretty shortly after 4:00 in the morning. I mean that is seriously early, and then it's easily light enough to walk around still at 10:30 at night. And obviously, the further north you go, the wider that margin gets. But if you think about what time the working day starts and finishes, and then how people manage their lives, the case for it sort of makes itself because exactly like you say, people don't simply change their alarm clock. So if you are either in a profession or you have a lifestyle that means that maximizing daylight makes sense, then yeah, you're quite right. You should just get up earlier. But if you are going to say, right, well, it would just be helpful for people to have daylight at the time where it's sort of more necessary, then my point is if we take midday, the meridian as being the time of the sun at its highest point, we are crazy in that we have such a short period of time, generally speaking, before that, and such a long period afterwards, and so we've moved away from it. I mean, with the previously using candles, lamps, whatever, but now with electricity, we don't really move according to daylight. And so people that don't go to bed until sometime, in the winter, it doesn't really make sense to manage your day like that. So I think that's sort of how it's come about, if you see what I mean, because we are choosing to spend a completely unequal amount of our day at either end of it, if that makes sense. I mean, it's crazy, but sort of now with where we are, necessarily so. I think the only way to resolve it in the UK would be to split it down the middle and have the half hour, like in India is on a half hour, Bhutan is on 3/4 of an hour, and somewhere else is at 1/4 past. Or so that would be the way to resolve it, because otherwise if you do want to have, broadly speaking, a day that we call the working day that does best fit daylight throughout the year without having to change the clocks, then you'd have to do the half hour.
Just as a matter of interest,
it looks like. Sorry, I was just going to say. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to have to worry about what Iran does for in another few weeks' time. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
What is the default time? So right now you're an hour behind me, and then the other half of the year you're 2 hours behind me. So what is the UK's default time?
GMT. So it would be 2 hours. We'd be 2 hours away. So we're on now. Yeah, what's called British summertime. I mean, the history of it, if one's to believe it, with John Harrison and his sea clocks, it is completely fascinating. But again, sort of weird that. Well, no, not weird. I mean, when you think going back to that time, people's days did start earlier and did not finish so late. So Greenwich Mean Time did make sense for those people then. It doesn't really make sense for the way that we operate now. So yeah, you're right. We should, if we were to avoid daylight saving, we should just alter our lives accordingly. But people won't do that in the same way that, we were talking about food earlier. People won't save food and therefore save money and not waste. I mean, it just, so where do we start? Where do we finish?
But Jeremy, I don't get your complaint in some way. I mean, I agree with it, but I don't necessarily get it because, of course, we don't even have to bother changing our clocks anymore. That's all done for us. So really, we just go to sleep one night and we waken up at the alarm the next day, and it's just happened. So, I mean, what's the problem?
You guys are aware, surely, that NATO and which is driven by the US has for a long time now been trying to find a way to.
Let me just stop you there for a second. Are you sure about that? Is NATO driven by the US, or is NATO actually driven by the UK? And who is actually producing the policy?
That's a very good question, Mike.
I think that actually NATO policy is coming from, we might call it an Anglo-American deep state axis. Let's say the various intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic are pretty much aligned, not necessarily aligned with the current regime in the United States, not necessarily aligned with the regimes in European countries, but certainly, I think, largely aligned with the policy objectives of the British Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. That's just my view. Charles, you may have a different one.
No, I mean not significantly. No, I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think the Iran situation, it is fascinating. We cover it quite a lot in the news, but the constant references to Iran being involved in absolutely everything that pertains to a threat to us or a threat to other countries in the Middle East. I mean, it's completely relentless from here, and it's almost all unsubstantiated, or it's the product of very, very crooked intelligence, if that's really the word for it, which I don't think it is. I mean, it's phenomenal, and also the efforts that are being gone to stir it up. And I was interested. The actually, again, going back to NATO, it's interesting. The UK sent an aircraft carrier strike group out from Portsmouth in was it in May or was it in April? I can't. It might have been late
April.
It was late, anyway.
Sometime, yeah.
And it was an extraordinary description for it. So it is described as a combat operation, Operation HIMARS. So it's not an exercise; it's an operation, and it was in conjunction, certainly in its first part, through the Mediterranean and then through the Suez Canal, with a sort of NATO escort or indeed sort of auxiliary vessels from NATO, and now they've turned west, turned left. I say they're in the Western Arabian Sea. So, without having to make people get the map out, basically they're going round Yemen, and of course Yemen now is absolutely chucked in with Iran, with Russia, and everything else. And almost laughably, part of the remit of the carrier strike group is trade relations in the Indo-Pacific. And, I mean, it's just hard not to see. I mean, I don't mean to be overly cynical, but it looks very much like its primary purpose is to be a magnet for fire, to draw fire, to provoke some sort of incident, and consequently, therefore, stimulate trade in weapons, and to further. We've just had the Strategic Defence Review released here. The only thing it's about is blowing everybody up with nuclear weapons and industry, and how everybody just makes packet. And it is completely extraordinary how people, especially given, we talk about people's memories, we're not that far from how everything was cooked up and then utterly sort of twisted before the Iraq War 2003, to the point where George Bush, it was even minuted in a meeting that Bush himself was talking about a false flag shooting down of an aircraft. I mean, so we're almost in that sort of territory now. It's totally perverse.
The reason why I mentioned the US earlier is I don't know if you're aware of the Path to Persia document that was published in 2009 by the Brookings Institution.
I think it's really important to understand the role of these think tanks, these policy think tanks and so on, because, they are effectively, they and the media to some degree as well, are effectively an arm and agents of the so-called deep state. So they are there to present the ideas to governments initially, and then the governments are representing these ideas to the people. And of course, this is another thing that most people get a bit backwards is what the purpose of representative democracy is, because it's not about, as I'm sure everybody watching this will know, but it's not about choosing individuals to represent our views to the legislature. It's about the so-called legislature representing the policy that has come from some other place to the people, and hopefully selling that policy well enough that they get voted in the next time round. So this is another area where we sort of get our view of how things work a bit crisscrossed.
But it's genius, because if you're a think tank, you don't have to take blame for anything. No, we didn't do anything. We just
right.
We just presented some ideas.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
That's exactly right. I mean, Mike and I began Wednesday's news this week with a kind of extended report on digital ID, and this is absolutely case in point. You look at the government's website and what the data access bill. We're just going through. It's effectively sort of gone through Parliament, and in that, in the government's writings on that, they're talking about a digital identity that is not mandatory. And then just a few days ago, a think tank very closely associated with the Labour Party, Labour Together, have produced a policy paper about something called a Brit card, which they're proposing would be mandatory, would be universal, but they're selling it on the basis that it will stop illegal migration and control overall migration. And that is basically, that's it. That's their sort of sole offering. But exactly like you say, they just sort of toss it on the heap and stand well back. And that's that. And then, but of course it enters public consciousness. It gets reported on. Actually, I don't know if it has been reported on by the mainstream, but it absolutely has. But anyway, so the point is valid, absolutely.
It's so absurd, though.
Aside from that, the government simply lied to us, and aside from the whole Brit card discussion, which is not settled yet, literally about 30 minutes ago, I received an email from Companies House in the UK demanding that I verify my identity digitally for future use on the Companies House website. So that's absolutely mandatory, and mandatory digital ID is here, no matter what the British government might say in their denials. It's here already.
Yeah, staggering. What's where is it at in South Africa on that front?
I think you might find that we are very far behind, and that's thanks to having a very inept state. We have pretty much a failure of a government, which is beneficial in many ways. It's depends on what hill you want to die on, but if you want chaos like we've got, that is accompanied by a sense of freedom. But if you want less chaos and a lot more control, then it is accompanied by things like digital ID and more central governance.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I do agree, and I think but what I would say, I would qualify that with what one's perspective is, because the reason I asked about South Africa is that there are a lot of organisations, the UN in particular, and the African Union, and then all the funders of that, the crew of wrong-un philanthropists who are desperate to give the impression that Africa really wants to embrace the tech revolution, and that digital ID is absolutely happening, and we're bridging the tech divide and all that sort of stuff, the digital divide. And then you talk to somebody who's there, who says no. I mean, it's really not. And I would agree. On the sort of the idea that the UK, let's say, which is a smaller landmass, a more dense population, a better established series of sort of urban spaces insofar as the connections and lines of communication stuff have been more enduring. But actually, I would say that going back to the oil, I mean, the oil can is looking quite empty. The way in which a lot of this stuff is supposed to work is now quite far removed from the way in which it actually does work. And one can point to both sides of the fence. I would say, whether it be the state, the sort of government systems, or indeed the other side of it, and what corporations promise to do. I mean, Marks and Spencer, for example. Because what's Marks and Sparks in South Africa? Woolworths, is it?
Woolworths, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So they had some tech. They were hacked or whatever it was, ransomware, I think, a couple of months ago. They are still not trading online after more than 2 months because they were knocked sideways. The vulnerabilities in all of this are absolutely vast, and I know I sound like a broken record on this, but it's very easy for the UK, for the British government, to give the impression that we are this extraordinarily well-oiled machine, and the truth is not at all like that. And also the distance that we have to come. I mean, I remember, just as an anecdote, I can remember shipping a vehicle back into the UK. It was only 10 years, in fact, not even 10 years ago. And it's quite an unusual thing to do as an individual. Obviously, there are a lot, hundreds come in, well, actually probably not so much anymore, but hundreds come in commercially, and that's fine. But in order to get it through customs, you have to have a code allocated to it. So you look down all the codes. And anyway, I spoke to the civil service department in Manchester that are meant to run this, and no one there had any idea how you're supposed to do it. So I filled out the form, and it said code, for import or whatever. In the end, I just made it up because I knew that they weren't going to know any better, but that something needed to go in this series of boxes. So that was the first point. The second point was, right, well, so how do I get it to you? Have you got an email address that I can attach it to? No. Can you fax it? And this was in 2015, I think. And fax was the only way you could communicate with this outpost of revenue and customs to do with vehicle imports and exports. So I'm not saying that they won't have evolved since then, but the idea, just because they say, oh yeah, we've got a one government login now, and in 5 minutes you'll be having a Brit card. It's really not. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. It's not that well oiled.
But I mean, just to add to what you're saying, right? I don't know what the geography is like where you guys live, but is it fairly easy to leave your home and take public transport and go into the city? Is it quite easy?
Well,
Mike, you go first.
Well, I live in the city, so that doesn't apply. But I would say that as a general rule, public transport is vastly lagging behind where the climate change proponents would want it to be. If there's a plan that people will be taking any kind of transport at all, of course. But bus services are appalling. Train services are appalling and vastly overpriced. So the answer is that public transport at this point is not fit for purpose.
Okay, but at least you have public transport. If I were to now leave my home and just go to the to the closest shop, I don't think I can unless I have a car. I'm just thinking I can maybe get an Uber, but that seems excessive. There isn't. That's it. I'd have to take an Uber or walk. That's it, and it'll be a long walk.
If, like in the UK, you rewrite your planning law predicated on the sort of post confected pandemic behaviours, and you say that everybody is going to be working from home, then you don't need public transport. People will ride their e-scooters or some other very dangerous device, and that sort of, that's what you say, or you don't bother. But no, I mean, I would agree with Mike. The area that I live in is rural. There are bus services, they do run, but to suggest that you could just manage your day in a sort of convenient sense according to bus timetables is ridiculous. I mean, I think.
Give you? Sorry, go on.
No. I mean, I was just going to say, like sort of trains or whatever. I mean, if you're ever wanting to make a return journey anywhere, I think in the UK now, as a rule, when they devise the timetables, it's more or less a given that that either it's deliberately designed so that you can't get somewhere and back in a day, or that if you can, you've got about a 7-minute window before you have to get on the bus or the train coming back, or that a connection will always just miss or mean a sort of an 8-hour wait. So yeah, it is a disaster. And actually, just we kind of joke about this. The other things, going back to where we started, because of this and because of what there isn't in the rural environment, it means that there is, and you've talked about this in South Africa, but people do have to be able to do stuff for themselves, and therefore they are dependable, and as such they are independent or more independent and dangerous. And so that's why there is such continued push to get them off the land and to push them into areas where they can be more easily managed and controlled and generally de-skilled. So I think that's the thing. But the other thing, I mean, what a joke on the climate thing. So trains in the UK, if ever you take your bicycle on a train, there is a little sort of compartment where you can hang your bike up. And I can remember first starting to do, take a bike on a train, I don't know, 30 or more years ago. And there were you had to book, and there were 3 little hanging hooks. So you could take a maximum of 3 bicycles on an intercity train, which can seat goodness knows how many hundred people. And the last time I did it, which admittedly was probably a couple of years ago, guess how many hooks there are on the train now? Still 3. So this whole idea that we are doing everything we can to get people into more efficient and sort of, modes of transport that are better for the environment or whatever, the whole thing's just complete nonsense. I go back to the sort of perspective thing. From the outside it might look like that because you can produce glossy videos and glossy pictures, but nothing's really changed. It's just got worse.
But that's maybe a good thing. Because hold on, it's a good thing in the sense that it shows that the agendas are not really succeeding at the pace that we keep thinking they are.
Yeah. No. I mean, you're right. I think one takes that. I suppose it's yes, it's difficult to eliminate the sort of potentially positive thoughts where you think, well, hang on a minute. I think if one does believe people of an older generation or older generations, I think there was a time where public transport, for example, did work. It was efficient, it was clean, and it was organised, and it was affordable. But somehow, in these times of intense progress, we are no longer able to achieve that. So yes, it is what is it? Is it a failed agenda or is it a deliberate agenda?
No, it's what I was alluding to earlier when Nick Hudson said that you have so many competing interests, even at those levels, that you end up with a lot of slowdown.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that's right because, so many people present the idea of this unified enemy, and it doesn't exist.
A few years ago, I decided to take my wife for lunch to a beautiful little seaside restaurant, maybe about 45 minutes car drive away from here. So maybe an hour to an hour and a half in the train. So I thought, well, let's be different. Let's take the train. Well, it was a tragic experience to the point that we had to get somebody to come and fetch us on the other side and drive us back. One of the stops along the way when we got off to change trains, a security guard came to us and said, "Are you sure you want to be here?" We said, "Okay, why?" So we're just changing trains. He said, "Yes." "Okay, I'm going to stand with you until you get on your train because this is not safe."
Well, I think we started in an interesting place with the land and removing people from it, and how how all this stuff connects back to itself, and exactly like you're talking about, why would a train service have ended up sort of being like that if it wasn't in some way all related to what's going on, and I think I go back to my point of just looking at who these outcomes do benefit, because there is there is always a benefit somewhere, and I think it's up to us to keep an eye on that and therefore sort of react accordingly, and in a way go in the opposite direction, and do as much as you can to sort yourself out, as it were, and just make sure that your life functions, and okay, your train experience obviously a shame, because wouldn't it be nice if it did actually work, but you just make a plan and you get on with it.
Let's stop changing the time twice a year.
I've got a sound effect for that. Hold on. Mike Robertson, Charles Mallet, thank you for joining me in the weekly banter.